presentation by our guest this evening, Elaine Gurian. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I'd like to remind you that we have a few more events planned for this semester. The final two lectures in our year-long colloquium, Ownership, Appropriation, Repatriation, Museum Collections in a Changing World, will be presented on April 7th when U of M Professor Amy Stillman will be talking about Hawaiian hula performance and issues of repatriation of cultural patrimony, basically intangible performance traditions as cultural patrimony. And then on April 14th, we have Professor Michael Brown from Williams College, who will be talking about indigenous knowledge, specifically that associated with ethnobotany and its relationship to museums. Also on April 14th, U of M Professor Richard Ford will deliver a lecture titled Skeletons in the Closet, Museums in the Collection and Display of Human Beings. If you'd like additional information about any of these presentations, please feel free to contact the Museum Studies Office. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Elaine Gurian, who is an independent consultant and advisor to a number of museums and visitor centers. Her forte is working with institutions who are either just getting off the ground, building new facilities, or reinventing themselves. Her current clients include the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of American History, both at the Smithsonian Institution, Mystic Seaport, the Barnes Foundation, and the National Archives of Guatemala. In the recent past, she has worked as a senior consultant for a number of institutions. To name just a few, the Museum of World Cultures in Gothenburg, Sweden, the Government of Argentina, the National Museum of Australia, Te Papa, the National Museum of New Zealand, the Antorchas Foundation in Argentina, the museums of the City of London, Leeds, Glasgow, Carlisle in the UK, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, and the Dubai Municipality Children's Museum. Some of you may be familiar with Ms. Gurian from her residence here in Michigan. From 1997 to 1999, she served as the acting director of the Cranbrook Institute of Science during a critical period of construction, redesign, and installation. We're working back in time here. 1991 to 1994, she was the Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which opened to the public in April 1993. During 1990 and 1991, Ms. Gurian served as Deputy Director for Public Program Planning for the National Museum of the American Indian. There, she concentrated on planning the move of the existing museum to the United States Customs House in New York City, and oversaw the architectural program planning for building a new collections storage facility and a museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C., which, as many of you know, just recently opened. From 1987 to 1990, Gurian was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Museums at the Smithsonian, providing oversight for all 14 Smithsonian museums. For 16 years, from 1972 to 1987, Ms. Gurian was the director of the Exhibit Center, the public facility of the Boston Children's Museum, known for exhibition and program experimentation and innovation, fostering enhanced family learning and service-oriented programs. And from 1969 to 1972, Elaine Gurian was the Director of Education at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, Massachusetts, where she was in charge of building community-controlled playgrounds during a period immediately following civil unrest. I could go on, but I think all of you get the picture. Elaine Gurian knows museums. In 2004, she was awarded the highest American Museum Award, the Distinguished Service to Museums Award by the American Association of Museums. In 1993, she won the Outstanding Learning Disabled Achiever Award from the Lab School of Washington, and the Distinguished Service Alumni Award for the class of 1958 from Brandeis University. In 1985, Gurian was presented with the Museum Educators Award for Excellence, America's most prestigious award for museum educators. Ms. Gurian served as editor of the volume Institutional Trauma, the Effect of Major Change on Museum Staff, published by the American Association of Museums in 1995. She is currently on the editorial board of Curator magazine and has just finished editing an anthology of her writings for a volume that is being published by Routledge Press. I might point out that a number of these essays serve as core readings for our year-long museum studies pro-seminar. Gurian was elected treasurer, vice president, and counselor at large for the American Association of Museums, the AAM. She has served as a board member of the American chapter of the International Council of Museums, a regional representative of the Museum Education Committee of the AAM, and vice president of the International Museum Education Committee of ICOM. She also was appointed a member of the AAM Task Force on Education, which created a very important white paper called Excellence and Equity, Education and the Public Dimension of Museums. She is presently the president of the Museum Group, an association of independent museum consultants. In her early career, she served as the art teacher for kindergarten through 6th grade at Solomon Schechter School in Newton, Massachusetts. Ms. Gurian holds the BA in Art History from Brandeis University and a Master's of Education in Elementary Education and Art Education from State College of Boston. Elaine Heumann-Gurian is one of the museum profession's most innovative thinkers, a person who has brought a great deal of critical and creative thinking to the practice of working in museums. She is one of only a handful of museum practitioners, one of a few visionaries in the field who occasionally steps back and writes on big issues concerning the museum and its role in society. We are very fortunate to have Ms. Gurian with us this evening. She has recently been exploring the opportunities and limits of spirituality in museums, the subject of her talk this evening. Please join me in welcoming Elaine Heumann-Gurian to U of M.
Thank you for that. Do you know how you do all of that in your career? You get old. I don't want you to get discouraged. You just put one foot in front of each other, and that's how it happens. I want to read you what was in my fortune cookie tonight. It says, present your best ideas today to an eager and welcoming audience. So you have your job cut out for you. I'd like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land. That's the opening statement of any public assembly in Australia. And it establishes at least the way we'll begin to think together about the issues of worldviews that are not our own and worldviews that are ours but that we don't illustrate into museums. For who are the original inhabitants of this land? Before I move on to the topic, let me say thank yous. First to Bradley Taylor and to Ray Silverman to remind me that I grew old doing all of this, but for their incredible generosity of bringing me here and of being very generous hosts. So thank you very much to both of you. To Ron and Ann Holtz, who are my family and who are braving the world of biology to come listen to the world of museums, so thank you for coming. To my lunch mates today, Ken Fisher, Amy Harris, and James Stewart, and for their generosity in showing me their places. Ray talked about speeches that you're going to have from other people dealing with issues like this. So one of the pauses I had was that university people know a lot about these issues, and it is in your curriculum. In fact, the museum world is influenced by what is in your curriculum and learns from you. So the issues that I'm going to talk about tonight are potentially not new at all to you. What I hope is new, and I hope you'll join with me in the context of, is what these issues mean in the world of museums, and how the museum world is grappling with issues that it frankly didn't seek, but finds itself in the middle of. I'm going to talk tonight about museums, and museums as institutions. It's really my work. So one of the things I'm hoping for is that you will start to think about museums, whether you work in them or not, as you know them, as you fantasize about them, and as you think you know them. Is this currently the age of the end of the age of rationality is really the question I have. Is this the end of that age? Is this a redress of the balance? And if you will join me on this journey, we will try and figure out where the pressures are in museums and where the new pressures are and how changes will happen. And let me start with a very short history of museums, at least museums in the last 35 years that I've been part of them. And I'm going to start with the mission. When I entered the field, can you hear me in the back? When I entered the field, the museum mission in AAM, in ICOM, in every museum was some variant on museums will collect, preserve, study, and educate, or display, the something or another, depending on what you said. The missions were almost completely unvaried. There were euphemisms for each of these terms, but that's what they said. They no longer say that. They have their own, they've all been rewritten and they have different things. You'll notice that the audience only dimly gets reflected in the last one. They came in this order, generally. Collect, preserve, study, research, and display and educate. Since then, a fifth one has happened, only in some places, called sustain, or encourage, or depends on what's going on. What I'm going to talk about tonight is how you think you know what these words are, and certainly the museum world thought they knew what these words are, and each one of these words has been really redefined. In part, and in a great part, and let me go back to this because I'm sorry I'm so croaky tonight, but that's the way it goes. The biggest influence on the redefinition of museums have been indigenous people worldwide. But the issues that indigenous people have brought to us are issues for which the cognate appears everywhere. However, the issue of indigenous people, because of the confluence of stars, I might say, that allowed them to gain power enough to knock on our doors with some loud knocking as opposed to small tin knocking that we didn't pay any attention to, has really happened only in the last 20 years. It did not happen first in the United States. In the Anglophone world, it happened much more particularly in Australia, in New Zealand, then in Canada, and finally in the United States. We like to think that because NAGPRA is the law of our land, that we were in the thick of it, but in fact we came late to the table. Interestingly, the negotiations on NAGPRA, which happened during my tenure at the Smithsonian and which involved the Smithsonian at the time saw fit to exempt itself in the legislation. So while they were players in the negotiation, they wanted to make sure that it didn't mean them, thank you. Subsequent to them, to that time, and I haven't read the legislation, they are players indeed, whether they are players in fact and are under the jurisdiction of NAGPRA itself. So that was what the mission statement was. At the same time, if you look at the other history, I mean, if you look at the history of the founding of museums, if you look at cabinets of curiosity, and thank you for asking that a cabinet of curiosity be set up in Amy's museum, which I much enjoyed. What they really were this already inbuilt tension, because they were specimens of scientific interest and voyeurism. At the same time, voyeurism, salacious, shocking, astounding. The Ripley, Believe It or Not Museum has its deep origin in the Cabinet of Curiosity. So we start not with the rational world only, but with this combination world between the rational objects of scientific inquiry and the most astounding objects you could find. I wrote, as my colleague has told you, many papers, and I'm going to read small bits of things that I wrote that other people wrote, but let me read you the opening of what's the object of this exercise. Why did the Serbs and Croats shell each other's historic sites when they had so little ammunition and these were not military targets? I routinely ask my museum studies graduate students these questions when I lecture, and they say immediately and without pause to break their spirit. Museums, historic sites, and other institutions of memory, I would contend, are the tangible evidence of the spirit of a civilized society. And while the proponents of museums have long asserted that museums add to the quality of life, they have not understood, as graduate students did when confronted by the example of war, how profound and even central that quality was. To break their spirit. Not a rational answer. What museums are, I think, have two components. One is that they are a site, a place. I mean, they have a lot of programs, but they are a place with all the attendant placeness for congregant behavior, for civic engagement. And they are the tangible evidence. And tangible, I say not original, they are the tangible evidence of our history and of the history that we inhabit. And it's that tangibility and that placeness, I think, that makes us special, but it doesn't make us unique. Nor do I think we're unique. If the essence of a museum is not to be found in its objects, then where? And I would propose that the answer is in being a place that stores memories and presents an organized meaning in some sensory form. It is both the physicality of a place and the memories and stories told therein that are important. Further, I propose that these two essential ingredients, place and remembrance, are not exclusive to museums. And finally, I contend that the blurring of the distinction between these institutions of memory and other seemingly separate institutions, like shopping malls and attractions, is a positive rather than a negative development. So, museums are, I think, a place that stores memory. And I know I have in the audience somebody who's very interested in the intangible evidence of memory. And I believe that one of the things museums are struggling with is their responsibility to the evidence of memory that's not tangible. And you see that they are building performance halls and social gathering spaces because of their interest in looking at holistic memory. I'm going to speak for a while, and then I'm going to stop speaking, and I hope you'll speak. This is, as I said, not only about indigenous people, but one has to follow the root of what indigenous people have asked worldwide of us and how it's affected museums. And so let me tell you a story that will begin us on that journey. When I was a youngster and went to school, I learned that Peter Stuyvesant came to Manhattan Island, whereupon he met Indians and bought Manhattan Island for $24 worth of trinkets. How many of you learned that story when you went to school? And what's the moral of that story? The Indians are stupid. Didn't they know that the island was worth at least $36 worth of trinkets or something? So let me tell you the story again. The Indians were on Manhattan Island hunting, and they met a group of people who said, "We'd like to buy the island from you, and we'll give you $24 worth of trinkets." And the Indians thought, what is he talking about? Land is not for sale. Land is not owned. Land belongs to Mother Earth. It is not a piece that we barter or sell. So if he wants to give us $24 worth of trinkets, the man is so stupid, we'll gladly bring it home as gifts to our families. So what you have is a disconnect in worldview, in which one set thought they had a transaction with other people. They understood the transaction about ownership. And the other people thought they had a transaction that had nothing to do with the sale of land. So let us stop a second and talk about ownership. One of the basis of museums we spend a great deal of time about is clear provenance. We own the stuff unless we made a mistake and we didn't check, and the owner who said they were the owner made a mistake, and it was a theft, or it was. But if we have clear provenance, we, the museum, own the stuff. Now people show up who point out that ownership is not one of the possibilities, not as we understand it, because the stuff is unalienable, like land, from the tribal collective. And however you got it, however legitimately you got it, whatever you paid for it, you don't own it. Which starts to deal with the issue of collect and who owns what. Let me read you a very short piece about stories of the people written on the occasion of the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian. Native objects are always interwoven into native societies that always carry complex meaning and significance. These objects are deeply narrative, often spiritual, quality that transcends their purely aesthetic dimension. These stories, of course, are every bit as crucial to their cultures as the historic narratives. That's written by Rick West, the director of the National Museum of the American Indian, who is now a tribal chief of his tribe, the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe of Oklahoma. And Dale Curtis Miles in this book wrote, as he's a Western Apache, "We do not like our stories referred to as myths. Our sense of who we are and our worldview is wrapped up in these stories. Even clothing, tools, baskets, and other material culture so important in everyday life have direct links to the stories of the people." So if you cannot separate the thing from the story, and if you cannot own it, then one of the big pieces of the collect starts to change. Now, NAGPRA, which I always get wrong, the acronym about Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. NAGPRA says that there are I believe five classes that however you got them don't belong to you. And that's in America. They are grave goods, human remains, that part you know. Grave goods, that's the stuff found with the human remains. That's associated grave goods and unassociated grave goods. That's stuff that was buried but you don't have the bones. And secret and sacred material. So whatever you have that falls into those categories by law in this country do not legitimately belong permanently to you. Now there's the long and complicated process about how they get returned, and the reality is once the law was passed, the individual negotiations were such that people didn't want the same thing to happen to everything. And therefore, the next things started to happen about preservation. So we collect and we preserve. Preserve, we thought, because we were good stewards, meant that we prevented anything from happening to stuff so it would not decay because we were holding it for posterity. That's preserve. And we learned lots of preserve techniques. Let me tell you that the most preservative of things is not to let anybody see it. Is to keep it in a controlled and dark environment in which nothing happens. So we don't actually live by those rules because the minute we take it out, we are into some level of degradation. And it is all an approximation thereafter. But now you have to come to another part of the indigenous people's worldview. Modern indigenous people, worldwide, at least the ones I have dealt with, are animists. It isn't that they're primitive people. It isn't they don't know the scientific thought. It is that they are animists and they have a foot in two worlds. And so are any religious people, not necessarily animists, but spiritual people have a foot in two worlds. That is, they have a world in which they use scientific thought and a world in which they use the thought of faith. For the Indians, because their things are tied up with their stories, the world of their faith is associated with their things. So, that's what singing and dancing at night means. When I worked for the American Indian Museum and helped run the first 12 negotiations with the community of Indians, they said things to me like, you know, if you have our stuff next to the stuff of our enemies and you go in there, the power will be so strong you could die. And my response really was, what are they talking about? And finally somebody said, you know, if you cover it with bubble wrap, it cannot sing and dance at night. And then I started to believe that maybe we didn't want our entire profession to rise and fall over bubble wrap. And it meant we had to start to look at issues of preservation within a cultural context that took us a while to get used to. Some things need to be fed with corn. Who else likes corn? The rodents we worked so hard to get out of the collection space. Some things need to be smudged with fire, which will set off the alarm system and the water and the... What are we going to do? And some things need to be used and then returned. And they get used and returned in a different state than they left. When we have spent all this time getting all that crud off the thing and having it perfect, and now somebody is going to put cranberry soup in it and send it back to us for safekeeping. What does that mean? And what it meant was that one by one we needed to reestablish in our head and by negotiation what it meant, what the preservation meant. Now, I know that you read Steve Weil, so I'll tell you when I first came to this idea. He said, yeah, but think of the crown jewels. The crown jewels, you can go to the Tower of London and see the crown jewels, but if the Queen or the King is being coronated, the crown jewels leave the Tower of London and adorn the head of the coronated one, only to be returned back to the Tower of London. We have done this forever. And what does long-term loan mean? Graham Beale is sitting here, and he gets things in hope, on long-term loan in hope that they will permanently be given to him, but in fact, when the owner wants them back, the stuff goes back and then it comes back again. Long-term loan, and that concept is a concept not of we own it and that we can decide what to do, but in fact, a concept I like to think of as a lending library. I went on the internet this winter and I discovered that historic societies, small historic societies, are doing what Indian museums have done for a long time, which is to allow you to lend them your family's story without giving it to them. They accession it without accessioning it. They make records of it, they display it. It's the same as long-term loan. The Macaw people in Washington State put their regalia on safe deposit with the museum unless they need to wear it. Then they withdraw it. It is a lending library, a whole different notion of what both ownership and therefore collection and preservation means. So that's two of these guys that don't have the same meaning they had when I started. The next one is research or study. If you go on the internet and look up Tapapa, one of the things you'll be able to see is the research protocol of something called Matarangamari, which is the analog research protocol of the Maori to the Western, or what they call Pakeha research protocol. Because things like the distribution of grants, and Ron sits here dependent on NIH, have to take into consideration that we have research protocols that match worldviews, and that when we start to research stuff that isn't ours, the research protocol itself starts to change to match the worldview of the people who own the stuff. So research has parallel lives. And what is considered content? I was embroiled in a quite ugly conversation in Australia because the National Museum of Australia is worrying over their view of their treatment of Aboriginal people. And it centers around two things. Were the people stolen, and therefore do they have to say they're sorry? And were there massacres? Now, both of these are legitimated by the Aboriginal people in oral history, but there is no, the white man's records of these things use different explanations and different reviews of this. So they were left with the belief that oral history is not a legitimate mode of inquiry, not a research, not an academically approved research, because it was the only way they could negate the information coming out of sources other than written down sources. So we all live today with oral history as part of the history we do. And yet it is not, it means that we have accommodated a worldview and are trying to look at sources other than the sources we used before as legitimate sources. We all levitated. We said, you must be joking. Oral history lives and is well in your university and all others. But so what are we up to? Education? Education. Well, education or presentation is all about what are exhibitions, what are appropriate conversations, what are teaching tools. And we started, at least in the museum business when I started, with the notion that if we owned it, we could say what we wanted about the stuff. And we could say it in however we wish to say it, third person, they believe this or that or something else. I spent a short conversation with Amy today looking at her dioramas. She has these gorgeous Native people dioramas, beautifully rendered. They've been in the museum on view for how long?
More than 40 years.
More than 40 years. If you transfer the intellectual ownership to others, namely the descendants of the material, and allow them to decide what to do, they come back and tell you, thank you very much, take those out of display. These are wonderful pictures of full frontal nudity, gorgeous women with various shaped breasts we can all come and see, back views of buttocks. You can imagine that the Native community, contemporary Native community, does not want this on view. It's frozen in time, and it displays them as less than modern and as object of sexual interest. So they want it off. Now, this is handmade objects, and it truly does belong to the museum. And the Indians wouldn't argue that it belongs to anybody other than the museum. But the depiction and the content and the story, we now legitimate, belongs to the descendants of the owners. And therefore, they have something to say about that. Now, let me tell you a story in New Zealand that really interested me. There's a famous New Zealand white painter, turn of the century until about 1920, 30, named Goldie. He painted kind of genre pictures of Maori people who had moko. Moko is what we call scarification or tattooing, but they're not tattoos. They really are scarification. It was the end, he thought, of moko for the Maori, and he did one after another genre painting. He had a set of people he did this with. They are not portraits of the people, they are genre setups, and they are extremely beloved. And there was a Goldie show, retrospective. It was curated by a white guy, and it went into a white art museum. And the first thing they did was invite the descendants of all the Maori children and grandchildren of these depicted people so they could greet their ancestors. The way Maori greet each other is nose to nose. Imagine what the people who had restored the painting thought. Nose to nose. The paintings got fed, and they did what's called anti-tapu. Tapu is taboo. They had the ceremony that would get the bad spirits out before they would allow anybody in the place. They did dual interpretation. Art history interpretation done by white art historians, and Maori interpretation done by the descendants of the family. Because for the Maori people, images of people are powerful people. They are not dead, and the spirit of the people is inhabited in the image, whatever the intention of the artist. And that was, he was a person well respected by the Maori people, and it was, of course, the way he was going to do it, even though it was in an art museum. So display, if you're going to deal with the descendants of the makers of the images, you are then into a negotiation about what display means. Now, that's not a surprise. What do you think the Enola Gay is about? The Enola Gay is about who owns the story of bombing, the United States bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And who won that argument? Whatever you think. The bombers won the argument. The descendants of the act. So the Enola Gay now can be seen at the Utahazi extension of the Air and Space Museum. You can see it there. It has a very small sign that says, "This is the plane that bombed," I can't remember if it's Hiroshima or Nagasaki. This is the Enola Gay. It is this big. It is manufactured by this company. The end of the story. Because all the ramifications of that were thrown out by the objections of the descendants of the story. And when you listen to the way in which stories are told, I mean, who do you think in the end controlled the story of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum? As historical as it is the story of the survivors. It is not the story of the perpetrators. The images and the objects are the objects saved by the perpetrators and documented by the perpetrators, but the story is owned by the survivors. So this is not just Native people. I'll read you a small piece. This is an article called "Singing and Dancing at Night." It's just come out in a book published by the Harvard the Center for the Study of World Religions of Harvard University. Not unlike my own family, museums are dedicated to maintaining a clear separation between the knowable and factual and the spiritual part of life. Museums traditionally have presented material, even religious material, as inanimate and interesting, but without power. Scientific thinking and seemingly fact-based impartiality were held in such high status in museums that objects of any religion were not to be venerated on display. I tell a story in here about how, being the deputy director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, now the name is Holocaust Memorial Museum. I mean, it's even embedded in its name. People started to say the prayer for the dead in the memorial, And I rushed down, because it's a federal museum, and we have separation of church and state. And I wanted to make a sign which said, "No praying here." But they sent me to my room, because they weren't having any. Veneration is safely relegated to place where such behavior is expected: the church, the synagogue, the mosque. To overtly embrace the passion inherent in or the ritual prescribed by the object is acknowledged to be the non-rational aspect of thinking. Now that starts not to be true. We have more and more examples of permitted veneration in museums, the Holocaust Museum being only one of them. There's a wonderful story in here about how the Newark Museum saves a Tibetan piece and the Dalai Lama comes and blesses it. The first public visitor of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, not by accident, I hasten to say, was the Dalai Lama, who rushed into the museum and did a ceremony, and we didn't stop him. So Papa has what's known as a marae inside the museum. It's like having the National Cathedral inside the Smithsonian. But now there are increasing examples in which the buildings of religious activity inside museums are again used for religious activity. I predict that there will be days when we stop having reliquaries just as reliquaries. In New Zealand, no Maori object will appear in a case without a leaf daily put on top of it as a sign of its connection to the living world. Everybody in New Zealand is so used to it that it's a kind of course. So, what's to happen? I think individual negotiation with people of good sense is about to change the boundaries of what we think are permissible, and we're about to change the locations for what we think of as spiritual life, and we're about to integrate what we think of as spiritual and rational life. Now let me digress 1 second and talk about the last election. I woke up the next day trying to figure out what actually happened. And I had a fantasy in my head, which was that John Kerry, it doesn't matter to me what you voted for, but my fantasy was that John Kerry got up every morning and he said, "I must have not said that right, so I'll get some more facts," because he thought that the decision about voting for president was in the rational side of life, and he thought he should have more facts. And that 50% of us, or 49% of us, who voted for John Kerry believed that the election decision was made from the rational side of life, regardless of what our spiritual life is like. And the other 50 or 51% moved the location for where spiritual life should enter, and moved it to the voting of the President of the United States. And they tell you that. It was an election about values and about morals, and in which incoming factual information was not relevant to the decision making. I went to Pennsylvania to work on the day before the election. My daughter lives in the heart of the religious section of Pennsylvania. And we went door to door, and I remember one woman saying to me, "I don't know who I'm going to vote for yet. I'm going to the ballot box, and God will tell me who to vote for." The terms of engagement, the clear separation about where and how we make what decisions are in fact changing. And they're changing in the museum world, and they're changing in our political world. And my instinct is that it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we're all going to have to get used to it. Let me tell you 2 more stories and then I'll stop. Well, one story and then I'll read you a small piece of the newspaper. I was in London when Princess Diana died. The amount of flowers that was put around Kensington changed the economics of Israel where the flowers were grown. I had no idea that was true, but it did, because they had to send in their year's supply. And all over England, there were these little votive locations. I remember going to all of them because it fascinated me. And one of them had a condolence card bought from the store, tied to a tree, saying, "Dear Diana, I miss you so much." Does that mean we have a postal service that goes to heaven? And what happens in the United States at the Vietnam Memorial, where names exist but no bodies, or the Second World War Memorial, where no bodies exist? People bring things and leave them at the base and write notes. And the memorial, which thought it was a memorial, has full-time curators and a storage facility because they feel obligated, as they should, to collect what is a transaction between the dead and fallen who are not there and the bereaved. So in our country, this is happening all over. In the newspaper, this is my last thing, E.J. DeYoung on 15 March wrote a column called "Rolling the Dice on the GOP Rift." It's about this delay stuff, which incidentally turns out to be about Indian gambling. So he said, even before the rise of the Native American casinos, the gambling issue regularly gave birth to strange bedfellows. Opponents of the proliferation of casinos have included some of the most liberal Democrats and some of the most conservative Republicans. Liberals see gambling interests as prying on the less well-to-do, and they argue that the growing dependence of state and local governments on revenue is a cop-out. The social conservatives speak of gambling as a tax on the poor, but their core objection is the old-fashioned moral assertion that it is simply wrong. Here we have, again, 2 worldviews coming together to vote, in this case, for the same issue, using one a set of what they think are rational arguments and one a set of what they think are spiritual arguments. And that's where we are today, both in the museum and, I think, in the world of the United States politics. Thank you very much. So now, what does that mean? What does it mean to you? What do you want to say? Except that you get to go to a party afterwards. Yes?
I'm not a museum studies person, so my questions are certainly going to be somewhat naive. But I am a historian. And my first reaction was that when I think of the dilettante students and collectors of the 19th century, it seemed to me that their ambitions to create curiosity cabinets was shallow and a little bit self-gratifying. And that when I think of the museum of today, saying, well, maybe it was, and how can we respect more the values that the creators attribute to these objects. It seems to me that we somehow dignify our impulse by being in more relationship, not just with the objects, but with the culture that we create. And I'm wondering, I mean, if people discuss at any length what the values are of this turn away from rationality toward toward the intangible. And then I'm assuming other people would want to talk about the opposite side, what we use or what we risk.
They have this conversation. My interest in the museum world is a both-and issue, which is how can we have the story of evolution and the creation stories of the people whose treasures we hold side by side without making a judgment, which opens the door right away to, are we responsible therefore to the creationists, which is always the question in that context, or in the Holocaust context, are we responsible to the deniers? And it's a very difficult decision, but from my point of view, if you are about to enter dialogue with community, then you have a very difficult time limiting, yes, this community and not this other community. And I think we're in for a bumpy road as we try and figure out these things. What historians want to say as objections are real. They're not wrong. The stuff may not be what they say it is. On the other hand, what the native or spiritual people want to say back is, so what? The power doesn't lie in the rational information, so that's where the tension lives. I'll tell you, my favorite story is a story of a Maori tribe. The Maori believe in transmigration of power. So they have a sacred object, this iwi, which people by testing pointed out really was a Victorian garden ornament, which the scientists believed that if they told them, light would dawn and they would stop venerating a Victorian garden ornament, to which they said it is what we say it is. It is the descendant of the original object, and it is exactly what we say. And then the question is, how old is it then? What's its age? What's its description? So I'm interested in the both and, how we keep records, how we tell the public, how the public gets to decide what is anarchy, I'm quite complicated, and you make a decision piece by piece by piece to do it. Yes?
Hi, I was wondering, I'd say from the research that I've read about Americans and our relationship to spirituality and religion, that the vast majority of us have some sort of connection to the spiritual, have some sort of religious inclinations, yet that hasn't really been reflected in research that's done on people's lives in the social sciences, partly because of the over-positivistic notion of what is science, what is rational, what can be explained, what can't. And so I'm sort of thinking about how this relates to museums and how museums can sort of capitalize on visitors' sort of desires to be in awe, to feel reverence, to make a larger connection with something larger than themselves. Museums can do this, or they should do this, and so what are the problems, especially when objects, as you know, have multiple stories. And when I can look at, a preserved fetus and marvel at the intricacies of humanity and complexities of our bodies, and someone else can look at that same fetus and, think of the horrors and the sanctity of life.
You posed the question exactly as it would be posed. And you're, as I said to a student last night, you're halfway on the way to resolving it, because the conversation, if you have long-term sustainable relations with the community that has trust on both sides, the decisions about acceptable behavior and acceptable presentations and not acceptable will be worked out between you. And the Bog people in Sweden are the descendants of or in Denmark. I can't remember where the Bog people, in Denmark. They're human remains. I taught in the National Museum of Denmark. I pointed out to them that they seem to have bodies in the museum, and that in my country, we no longer have bodies in the museum, at least not on display. And they said, yeah, but those are our bodies. We can have them on display if we want, and we want. And it was a big eye-opener for me, because the reverse of the coin is that it is their bodies, and they can. So these decisions are going to be made carefully. We're going to make them and get it wrong. If you don't have avenues for conversation between the aggrieved parties, danger to your institution is much worse, because they can bring you down, than if you are willing to at least join in the negotiations. Yes?
Well, the new ideas being about new goals of enlightenment, which we're going to be reaching at this point, I still fear for the future of the museum as it's been, which I think has value its own. Somehow, I see the situation as having been a monolithic display of an object. The objectivity of rationally determined objective truth. That there is a certain power vested in an object simply through that. So how can we maintain the museum as essentially an academic institution while still catering to the spiritual side of things? Because inherently this almost undermines it.
I think the museum as you know it is being broadened, and the maintenance that you talk about can't happen. Now, I've never been an advocate for its maintenance, so you want somebody standing here who likes museums as they are. But I'm not one of them. So I'm not, and I'm not because what I've seen them as is really the stronghold of people who, while qualified, decided to let the rest of us know what the truth was, with or without our permission. And I would rather have access to a variety of interpretations of the truth and think of myself as a grown-up than what I think the organizational structure of the museum in the past has been. So you need, if we're going to have a debate, the other person, you have to ask the question of the other person who's not here tonight. I'm a very fundamental believer in the patrimony belongs to us all. It is our soul. And for us to access it, we will need to learn ways of making it possible to enfranchise the visitor to make sense of what is really multiple information sources. That's what the internet is. And I think we're going to have to do that. And I also think, and back to the woman who was here, about intangible stuff, that we have to start to believe that sites of memory have to include not only tangibility, but intangibility. Because the tangible transmitters of culture really are only some cultures. Yeah, the easiest way to understand it is that there are many cultures, because they were disenfranchised people, while they had things, the things are gone. In which case, you would have me say to you that I can't tell the story of slavery because we don't have anything. But in fact, we better tell the story of slavery and figure out the alternate methods of that transmission, most of which are intangible. Our story and song and language and word choice and things like that. And museums are bad at the display and accessibility of non-tangible material. So it's a very big and fruitful next for all of us. Yeah?
My personal experience of museums is from a country where the past has been part of the national discourse, nationalistic discourse.
Right.
For a very long time. So some of the stories have been so appropriated that they no longer exist. Or rather, the people who claim them no longer want them because they are counter to what they have made to believe for so long. So there is an interesting example, for instance, where some museums started to integrate an ethnographic narration in their exhibitions, and the public just did not like it. And so that's another side to your story, and I don't know how I think that particular case of Greece is a very particular case. Greeks are very connected to your past, but it's an interesting other example to your example.
No, it's a very important. Did you hear that? No, let me say what she said, which is that often in national museums, now if I get it wrong, make sure, in national museums, the story as told is the appropriated story. So when balance is put back in the institution, the very people who you think will benefit from it don't want that to happen. I once had a long conversation with formerly colonized Africans and said, you know, now that you have your own country and you've inherited these museums, you can reconceive them to match your culture. And I remember, this is now 20 years ago, them looking me in the face and saying, yes, but why would we want to? I mean, we are talking, and in some ways that's what you're asking, we're talking about institutions, qua-institutions as objects of authority. And for disenfranchised people who wish to have their story told, what they often want is the reproduction of the authority figure that they actually don't like. So that's, and it happens all the time. And my instinct is you have to live through that. Why, as your first story, should you tell bad news, or should you use untried methods, or should... So I'm very sympathetic that the first story of formerly marginalized people often looks like a museum that I wouldn't do, but that's okay. It's not my story. Yes?
Structure these institutional hierarchies in the institutions of the museum to incorporate these other voices actually within the museum system itself, and it kind of goes towards what, the dialogue of who is qualified to hold these positions, to make these decisions. And the second part of that ties into this other question, which is museums having a vested role in many situations in the control of history, in the control of the story, and the creating the narrative of a people. And very often these people don't want to be reject that story even. The Enola Gay story made me think of that. You know, since we won the war, the bomber gets to tell the story. And what's the conflict?
Again, did you all hear that? Are we all there? Okay. These are very good questions, and these are reproductions of real life. That's what happens. What I see now worldwide is that museums are retreating so that they can, like my Greek colleague has suggested, close the doors and own the story more clearly and tell the story more ideologically. And the world is a much more timid place than it was 10 years ago, on the one hand. And the most timid places tend to be the places of where the national story is made real. And the places that tend to play are small, below-the-radar screen locations where they think it won't matter at all. Those places where they play and where they're below the radar screen get to be famous because everybody, it solves your conscience or you're really interested in it as a model. And I wander around collecting those models. And as they get more famous, they get more timid. The stakes get too high and the pressure to tell the story. These are, in fact, the national story or the people's story made visible. So it's a dangerous world out there. And I am, at the moment, think that the museum world reflects the political world. So it is more, on the one hand, spiritual, but it is also more ideologic and much more timid. Yes?
Number one on your list of originary missions of museum institution to collect means that there are places in the world where there are indigenous communities, but the earliest and most potentially historically significant artifacts were collected 200 or 300 years ago and now sit at the other end of the globe from these native communities. I would just love to hear your language for how you might describe some of the possible mechanisms for reuniting these communities with their patrimony elsewhere.
Well, I'm sympathetic to both sides of the story, which is that people need access to their stuff, on the one hand, especially alienated stuff. And on the other hand, they wish to tell their story to others, which requires that their stuff be someplace else. What I like to see is the negotiations of precisely that, and the negotiations are incredibly varied as outcomes, much more varied than one would think. The Torres Strait Islander people got the stuff from the British Museum. Now the British Museum, the Big Bear, owns much of the conquered people's stuff, and Hawaiian stuff is there as well, I think. Got it on long-term loan, got it to go back to the Torres Strait Island. There was talk that they would not return it, and I have no idea whether they have or not. Sometimes people want to trade. The stuff has very special significance. They want it back, but they will trade something that has less significance, which they own. Sometimes they agree to joint ownership. Sometimes they allow it to go home and it never returns. There's a movement by some museums, which I think will never hold together, called the Universal Museum. A statement was put out by the biggest holders of stuff. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Met, I can't remember who else, which said we're going to be declared universal museums and therefore nothing we own has to go anywhere because we are the repository of the world. I don't think that will hold. I think for the people I know the best, which are the American indigenous people, almost none of their stuff that's older than the late 18th century is in this country. Almost all the stuff here is 19th and 20th century stuff. And all the stuff of American Indians that's older than that is elsewhere. It's true for conquered peoples all over the world. And what happens when the stuff goes home is fascinating because the reinvigoration of the community that produced it is a palpable reinvigoration. What they do with the material is much different than what we do with their material. So I'm incredibly sympathetic that it needs to go home. Whether it needs to go home forever is the issue for me, and under what circumstances are the parties willing to talk to each other? And I have no idea what that is. American museums have had to learn that even though they owned it under the law, when it went back, it did not have to ever see light of day again without the permission of the people who owned it. And it meant they had to get used to that. The New Zealand people who believe that all Maori material is owned by the iwi find that less surprising, and so when stuff is told to go home, the stuff goes home. What would you want as a member of a group that has material in lots of places?
I could be happy with access. In posing the question, I had a very specific example in mind. There's a major Hawaiian dam in Kuka'i'imoku, and there are 3 magnificent statues of Kuka'i'imoku in the world today. One is at Bishop Museum in Honolulu on display. One is at Peabody Museum in Salem on display. The third was on display at the Museum of Mankind in London, which has since closed and is now in storage. I go to London, I cannot see Kuka'i'imoku.
And has anybody negotiated with it being sent someplace so that you can see it?
To my knowledge, no. That doesn't mean. I would be very surprised if there have been no discussions to date yet.
The Bishop Museum has tried to declare itself a sacred site so that its stuff doesn't have to go home. The Peabody Museum, the stuff was brought by ship captain, mostly somebody named Pittman. The descendant of Pittman, Bonnie Pittman, is one of the most influential members of the museum community in the United States, and so she often negotiates on behalf of that. Dan Monroe, the director of the Peabody, is the architect of NAGPRA, so access to the material that the Pittman brought is probably the easiest location of all of them. And the reason I know these stories, but it tells you also that these negotiations happen with people who are known and who have faith, good faith and good connections, and are more difficult with people who are also known but who have no interest in this. You guys should be allowed to go home. I'll take one question or no questions and then wish you a really nice evening. Yeah, you get the last one.
I'm curious about where you see the lines being drawn in terms of what communities have a stake in which objects. In the case of Native American communities who are talking about access to materials from the past couple hundred years where there's a clear cultural connection. The rights are not, I would say, not significantly in doubt, at least under the current climate of thinking about repatriation of materials. But if you start thinking about, for example,
Kennewick Man.
Pardon?
Kennewick Man.
Exactly. Or to take a more extreme example, human remains from Great Britain that are several thousands of years old that have been in museums for decades, but are now being agitated for repatriation and burial by members of the neo-pagan and neo-shamanic communities in Great Britain who view them as their spiritual ancestors, even though there's no evidence of any direct survival of those traditions in the British Isles. I was wondering what you think of those sorts of movements and where we draw the lines about who are the stakeholders and who has a say.
Well, I would rephrase your question and say that there's a question about every single bone of every single tribe. There's questions of who are the legal spokespeople for the tribe. How do we know, and what's the forensic that this belongs to that and doesn't belong to somebody else? And there is not a simple answer to the fact that we have put human beings in boxes and what we should do with them. Some tribes don't want the bodies back, even though it's very clear, because they think their soul has been disconnected or something else has happened. So I don't draw a line anywhere. And so it becomes very complicated and very expensive. Kennewick Man, do you know what Kennewick Man is? Kennewick Man is a set of bones found in a river, I believe, near Kennewick or in the Kennewick River. It's a set of bones much older than we thought, and the bones have Caucasoid features. The Indians who live in the neighborhood where these bones were made are Indians that were displaced and replaced in the American landscape. Who these bones belong to and can they be looked at for forensics and tell us something about this went to court to try and determine standing, precisely that you're talking about. Who has the standing and can therefore claim? Each one of these turns out to be extremely complicated. On the other hand, there are some Christian bones now in the United States where, because of our issue of spirituality, there's a movement by the clergy to bury white guys. And then the question is going to be, in what faith and whose white guys are they? So nothing is simple in this life. Thank you all very much for coming.